variegation. It's a bit of a buzzword amongst plant enthusiasts everywhere, and cactus and succulent collectors are certainly no exception. And why would they be when you've got insane plants like this going around? So today we're going to look at what variegation is, how it manifests in cactus and succulents, and also how best we can care for them so they don't end up looking like weird brown scabby things. Let's jump down the variegation rabbit hole and see where it takes us. Now, the first thing we really need to do is interrogate what exactly is variegation. And to understand that question, we need to understand where plants get their colouring. And what better model than this Trichocereus Dr. Funkenstein? How good's the cultivar name, by the way? Because this guy's got a bit of a split personality. Now, most plants are green, as we know, and that green colouring comes from a chemical called chlorophyll, which essentially enables plants to take sunlight and transform it into energy. It's their food source in a way. Keeps them happy and keeps them healthy. Where there's an absence of chlorophyll, that's where we end up with variegated tissue. Essentially, areas that can't photosynthesize. What that actually means is that variegated plants are a bit deficient. That's why they're harder to grow, why they're a bit more pest-prone, disease-prone. Because this guy, for example, has only half the photosynthesizing area. Now, ordinarily, we find these plants in nurseries because they're stunning to look at. They're absolutely beautiful. That coloration is something that many collectors adore. But interestingly, plants can also be naturally variegated. For example, this species, Aloe irofensis, every plant in this species is covered in these tiny dots of variegation. Why? No one's quite sure, but it's an interesting thing nonetheless. However, like I say, typically variegation is something that we find in nurseries, in collections, in the horticultural trade. In some instances, there can be plants that are widespread, such as this Crassula ovata Hummel's gold, which, when it's exposed to sunlight, the leaves turn this marvelous yellow, red-tipped margins. Outstanding. Or another common one, Euphorbia mammillaris variegata, sometimes called the corncob cactus, even though it's not a cactus at all, which has a more kind of white variegation interspersed with little flecks of green. However, new variegated plants are entering the market all the time. A few relatively recent ones. This is a Euphorbia pulvinata hybrid, and this is a Euphorbia obesa hybrid. And you can see both of them, outstanding stripes of variegation. Absolutely fascinating. So today, the goal is to have a bit of a look at what variegation looks like across the span of the world of cacti and succulents. And as you can imagine, these plants being more deficient need a bit of extra care. So that'll come after. Let's see how we go. Variegation manifests in all sorts of different ways in cacti and succulents. But today we're going to be focusing on three main types. And the first of those are plants that are lacking in chlorophyll altogether. These are plants called albino plants. And because they have no chlorophyll, it means that they have no way to photosynthesize the sun's energy, and therefore they can't actually live on their own roots. They need to be grafted to a stock plant. We might actually be familiar with one of these, the ubiquitous Gymnocalcium mihanovicii hibbertan, which is the red moon cactus that we can find in nurseries all over the world. This is a plant that originated in Japan from a random mutation and has since been cultivated so far and wide that it's almost seen everywhere. Try to take that little red moon off its dragon fruit stock, however, and it's going to die a very quick and sad and miserable death. But that's not the only albino plant in cultivation. In fact, even some very rare plants have got albino forms. For example, the cultivar of Euphorbia abdulkuri, called damask. Now, Euphorbia abdelkuri is typically a grey, concrete-looking thing, but its albino form is a beautiful pink colour. Quite a stunning contrast. So albino plants are a fascinating but very delicate form of variegation. They're very prone to disease, and often their lifespans are quite short. Now, the next type of variegation we're going to look at are, I suppose, your streaky or stripy plants. Now, typically, variegation follows the veins of a plant's leaves. And in plants with a more kind of grassy habit, what we call monocots, those veins run in parallel lines through the leaves. And so when they're variegated, that's why we end up with these kind of lengthwise stripes. We're talking about plants like your agaves, like haworthias, aloes, gasterias, and other similar plants. Now, the way that this variegation represents itself through these leaves is quite stunning. Take a look at, for example, some agaves, Agave potatorum ice cream, or its relative, Agave potatorum kishokan. Now, these two plants show you how different versions of variegation within the same species can be quite remarkable in their beauty and in their difference. Another Agave desmentiana galactic traveller, typically growing with these quite stunning blue leaves. Here we find it accentuated with these very beautiful yellow leaf margins. An absolutely stunning cultivar. Moving away from agaves into the wonderful world of haworthias, where there's a whole cottage industry developing ever more complex and beautiful cultivars, we can see just a very small smattering of the broad expanse of amazing variegated plants. For example, this Haworthia Mordor, which looks almost a little bit evil in its variegation. Or, alternatively, Haworthia picta cobra with a reverse variegation effect, which is absolutely stunning. Say no more though than when we look at Haworthia truncata and its many different forms of variegation with these incredible stripes running down the leaves. You give them enough light and what you'll actually find is that they can almost glow with different yellows, oranges and reds. They're a stunning plant, even unvariegated, but when you bring in those stripes, utterly irresistible. Or Gasteria armstrongii, a Haworthia relative, which has these very strong, bold contrast between its green and yellow. And so that's just a tiny sampler of what these monocot variegation patterns can look like, but I think you get the picture. Utterly irresistible, and you can see why they're so desirable and so collectible. Now, the third type of variegation we're going to look at today is our more marbled or blotched form. And without going into too much technical detail, we find these in our dicot plants. Plants like cacti, euphorbias, members of the Crassulaceae family like echeverias, crassulas themselves, even plants like lithops. Now, dicots, the leaf veins run throughout often the body of the plant in a network, which enables quite rich and detailed patterns of variegation to emerge. We can see this, for example, in the marbled form of Astrophytum asterius nishiki, which is a Japanese origin cultivar. In this instance, you can see the winter temperatures have given the variegated portions quite a beautiful orange hue. Or, alternatively, Copiopoa dura, which in this instance very lightly variegated all over the plant, enabling it to continue to photosynthesize despite being on its own roots. We looked at Gymnocalcium mihanovicii hibitan earlier, but that's not the only form of variegated Gymnocalcium in cultivation. This is a marbled example of the same species, which, as you can see, is absolutely stunning. And with those flowers, even more so. Moving away from cacti, we've also got things like the Echeveria blue metal variegata. Now, echeverias themselves have been bred and hybridized relentlessly to create some absolutely stunning forms. And when you bring in variegation, they only get more incredible. Staying, of course, in the world of the Crassulaceae, we talked earlier about Hummel's gold, and you can see how those leaves have got this rich network of different colours and patterns running through them. Consider, though, lithops and the incredible and remarkable ability of even a lithops to be variegated, as in this Lithops julii Kikusho variegata. What an amazing and remarkable specimen that is. And of course, I don't want to neglect my old mate, Dr. Funkenstein here, who's got an even more stunning variegated form, because this is a crested plant. And as you can see, one half of the crest is variegated and the other half is green. What you can call this is a bicolour crest. What a remarkable world these plants inhabit. Now at this point you might be wondering, where do variegated plants come from? And the answer is not the nursery. No, it's more of a genetic lottery. You sow enough seeds and eventually variegated plants will start to show up. Now I've sown heaps of cactus seeds over the years, and although I've seen lots of albino plants, this variegated Gymnocalcium bossingianum is maybe the only natural variegated plant that I've ever reared from seed. It's grafted to give it a bit more vigour. Plants can also throw variegates when they offset or pup. Essentially, I suppose there's a bit of genetic variation that occurs and you end up with a cactus with a variegated arm. However, variegation can also be induced, man-made, just not very well. For example, take a look at these Astrophyta mysterious that I found being sold on Etsy. You can see the variegation pattern is unlike anything that we've seen in today's video, and that's because it's been chemically induced. Whoever's selling these has applied a chemical that has stripped the chlorophyll from the growth point of these plants. Now, what will actually happen is that as these plants grow, the new growth will be green, the variegated portion will fade, and you'll end up with what is essentially an ordinary Astrophyta mysterious, which isn't a bad thing, but you're just not paying variegation prices for it. We also think of variegation as being solely the domain of cultivation, but that's not necessarily the case. No, although variegated plants are indeed often weaker and more prone to disease, we can find them in nature. Take a look at this Carnegie gigantea, the saguaro, growing very happily in habitat with a beautiful variegation pattern. And so it becomes quite clear that these are plants that can thrive if given even just a little bit of love, even by Mother Nature. So in this final section, we're going to have a look at how we can keep our variegated plants happy and ensure that the plants that we pay very good money for in some instances don't rot away into an untimely death. So how do we care for these plants? Well, for the most part, we can treat them like they're brothers and sisters. Dr. Funkenstein here is a Trichocereus, so you'll be getting the same soil mix and watering as the other trichos in my collection. However, there are two main considerations that we need to take into account with variegated plants. First of all, pathogens like fungal infections, as well as introducing them to sunlight. When it comes to pathogens, healthy plants are often very capable of fighting them off themselves. However, variegated plants by default are not strictly healthy. That means that things like fungal infection or pests, they often need a little bit of assistance. If you notice brown or black spots on your plant, you'll want to step in with a systemic fungicide product. Something like this Rose Shield works for me. And of course, if you see pests on your plants, mealybugs, scale, thrips, your choice of deterrent. I like the eco soap stuff, agricultural soap, but There are, of course, things like isopropyl alcohol, which is great for dealing with mealybugs, and of course imidacloprid, which is kind of a nuclear option and really should be avoided on anything that's going to flower. You don't want to hurt the bees. When it comes to introducing these plants to sunlight, well, they don't mind full sun, which comes as a bit of a surprise. You just have to introduce them slowly. If you're taking it from a nursery, from a cardboard box because you've got it through the post, well, what you'll want to do is very, very gradually introduce it to full sun. Start it off in bright shade, and then over a period of maybe 2 weeks, give it a little bit more sunlight each day. If you don't, what will happen is you'll end up with sunburn, which will provide quite unsightly and hideous scars, and they're not going to heal. And so your beautiful plant is going to be beautiful no more, at least until it starts to grow out of them. So that's the wonderful world of variegated cacti and succulents. I hope you've learned something, and I hope it's been interesting. If you've got any questions, hit me up in the comments. As usual, you can find me on Instagram at bayou.brothers. If you've made it this far, maybe subscribe. You don't have to, it's up to you. Anyway, happy growing.